They all believed the claw marks meant someone inside was about to die. When the Alpha King's legendary beast carved 4 deep slashes across the door of a forgotten cottage, every wolf in the kingdom stepped back in fear. Warriors refused to cross the threshold. Hunters abandoned the forest. Even the king's own guards lowered their eyes and walked away. But inside that tiny cottage lived no queen, no noble, no powerful warrior. Only a quiet woman who had once been sold as a slave, and the little girl she had rescued from the ashes of a burning village. She had no royal blood, no pack, no family left. Yet somehow, the most feared beast in the kingdom had chosen to guard her home. The Alpha King himself had no idea why his beast kept disappearing into the northern forest every night. He believed it had become restless, perhaps even dangerous. He never imagined it had already found something his own heart had forgotten. As old enemies return, ancient pack laws threaten to tear a child away from the only mother she has ever known, and a mystery older than the kingdom itself begins to awaken. Because those claw marks were never a warning of death. They were a promise. And before this story ends, the entire kingdom will discover why no wolf in the pack ever dared cross the beast's mark again before sunrise. When the sky was still a deep shade of blue and the first birds had not yet found their voices, the edge of the Alpha King's territory rested beneath a quiet blanket of mist. Frost clung to the grass, and the cold wind carried only the whisper of pine trees rubbing against one another. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made even warriors lower their voices. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing hinted that, by the end of the hour, an entire kingdom would be speaking in frightened whispers. 2 palace servants walked along the narrow forest path carrying baskets filled with bread, herbs, and fresh milk. They had traveled this road every week for nearly 3 years, delivering supplies to a forgotten little cottage that stood alone beyond the village. It belonged to a woman few people truly knew. Some remembered that she had once arrived in chains with a caravan of slaves. Others only knew that she lived quietly, never asked anyone for help, and spent her days caring for a little girl who was not her own. The older servant yawned as he adjusted the basket on his shoulder. "It feels colder today," he muttered. His younger companion nodded, rubbing his hands together. "The forest doesn't sound right." They stopped walking. The silence was strange. Usually, wolves could be heard somewhere in the distance. Birds greeted the coming dawn. Even the wind seemed to carry life. Today there was nothing, not a single sound. The cottage slowly emerged through the mist. Then both men froze. The baskets slipped from their hands. Fresh milk spilled across the frozen ground. Neither servant noticed. 4 enormous claw marks had been carved into the wooden front door. The grooves were deep enough to expose the pale wood beneath, each slash perfectly straight, impossibly powerful, as though iron blades had torn through solid oak without resistance. The older servant's face lost all color. "No." His voice barely escaped his lips. "It can't be." The younger servant stared without blinking. I've seen those marks before." "Where?" The answer came as little more than a whisper. "On battlefields." The older man slowly stepped backward. The Alpha King's beast. Neither man needed another explanation. Every child in the kingdom grew up hearing stories about the king's legendary white wolf. Warriors spoke of it with respect. Enemies spoke of it with terror. Few had ever seen it and remained calm enough to describe what they had witnessed. The beast was not simply large. It was ancient. Its instincts were older than the laws of the pack itself. Most frightening of all, it never left marks without purpose. The younger servant instinctively reached toward the door, intending to wipe away a loose splinter. His hand stopped halfway. A chill ran through his entire body. His wolf stirred uneasily inside him, filling his chest with an overwhelming command. "Do not touch." He jerked his hand back immediately. "I can't." The older servant nodded. "I know." Neither understood why. They simply obeyed the instinct every wolf carried deep within their soul. Those marks were not damage. They were a warning. Without another word, both servants hurried back toward the village, leaving the untouched baskets scattered across the path. Inside the cottage, life continued as though the outside world had not changed. A small fire crackled gently in the stone fireplace. The scent of warm oatmeal filled the room. Near the window stood a young woman with soft brown hair tied loosely behind her shoulders. Simple clothes covered years of quiet hardship, but nothing about her carried bitterness. Every movement was careful, patient, and filled with quiet purpose. She stirred breakfast with one hand while mending the sleeve of a tiny winter coat with the other. Across the room, a little girl no older than 6 struggled to pull thick wool socks over her tiny feet. She frowned dramatically. "They're fighting me again." The woman smiled without looking up. "I think the socks are losing." The child giggled. "No, I'm winning." "You usually do." The little girl finally pulled the second sock into place and proudly stood on the chair. "I told you." The woman laughed softly. "You certainly did." There was warmth inside the cottage that no fire alone could create. Every blanket had been repaired more than once. Every wooden chair showed signs of careful mending. Nothing was expensive. Everything was loved. The little girl climbed onto the table and watched breakfast being served. "Will the bread men come today?" "They usually do." "They're late." The woman glanced toward the window. "They probably found muddy roads." The child accepted the answer, but the woman felt something she could not explain. The morning was too quiet. Even the chickens outside had stopped making noise. She slowly looked toward the front door. For a brief moment, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Not fear. Something stranger. As though the forest itself was holding its breath. The little girl noticed her expression. "What's wrong?" The woman quickly smiled. "Nothing. But you looked outside." "I was only listening." "For what?" He paused. "I don't know." Outside, the village had already begun changing. Word spread faster than fire through dry grass. People left market stalls unfinished. Hunters abandoned the forest. Guards quietly gathered in nervous circles. No one argued about what they had seen. Everyone described the same thing. 4 claw marks. Fresh. Impossible. Made by only one creature. Some whispered that the beast had claimed the woman as prey. Others insisted it had cursed the house. Older wolves said nothing at all. Their silence frightened everyone even more. By midday, mothers were calling children indoors before the sun had even reached its highest point. Travelers avoided the road leading toward the cottage. Even horses refused to walk near it without nervous snorts. Inside, the woman remained completely unaware of the panic growing beyond the trees. She simply helped the little girl button her winter coat before brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face. "You look beautiful." The child smiled brightly. "Even with fighting socks." The woman laughed. "Especially with fighting socks." The little girl wrapped her small arms around the woman's waist. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, an entire kingdom feared what waited behind one simple wooden door. Inside, all that existed was the quiet love between a woman and the child she had once refused to leave behind. Neither of them knew that somewhere deep within the silent forest, unseen golden eyes were watching the little cottage with unwavering devotion, and that the creature who had carved those impossible marks had no intention of letting anyone cross that doorway again. The little cottage remained peaceful, but beyond its walls, whispers continued to spread across the Alpha King's territory. No one understood why the beast had marked the door, and no one was brave enough to ask. While rumors grew louder in the villages and the palace, the woman found herself staring into the flames of her fireplace that evening. Her thoughts drifting somewhere she rarely allowed them to go. The little girl had already fallen asleep beneath a patched wool blanket, hugging the small cloth rabbit the woman had sewn years ago. The child slept peacefully, unaware that her very existence had become the center of fear and mystery. The woman gently tucked the blanket around her shoulders before turning back toward the fire. The dancing flames reminded her of another fire. A fire she had never forgotten. Years earlier, before she had become the quiet woman everyone overlooked, She had lived in a small border village nestled between snow-covered hills and endless pine forests. It had not been wealthy, but it had been full of laughter. Every evening, smoke rose from warm chimneys, children chased one another through narrow streets, and neighbors left their doors unlocked because everyone knew everyone else. She had believed life would always remain that simple. Then one night everything changed. She remembered waking to screams instead of birdsong. The sharp smell of smoke had filled the air before she even opened her eyes. When she stepped outside, her world was already burning. Homes that had stood for generations collapsed beneath roaring flames. Wolves fought desperately through the streets, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Riders wearing the colors of ruthless slave traders swept through the village, chaining anyone who survived. She searched desperately for her parents, for friends, for familiar faces. Instead, she found only frightened strangers running in every direction. Someone grabbed her wrist. A rough voice shouted, "Move!" Iron chains wrapped around her hands before she could resist. She stumbled forward with dozens of other prisoners, forced toward the edge of the village while smoke darkened the morning sky. Then she heard it. Cry. "We." Almost lost beneath the crackling fire. She stopped walking. The guard yanked her chain. "Keep moving." But the cry came again. It wasn't the cry of an adult. It was a baby. She turned toward the sound despite the guard's angry shout. Beneath the shattered remains of a collapsed cottage, a tiny hand reached through broken wooden beams. Without thinking, she pulled against her chains. The guard struck her across the shoulder. "Did you not hear me?" She barely felt the pain. All she could hear was the frightened child crying beneath the ruins. Another prisoner whispered urgently, "Leave it. You'll be killed." But she couldn't. Somehow, despite the chains around her wrists, she dropped to her knees beside the broken house. Splinters cut her hands as she pulled away burned pieces of wood one by one. The crying grew louder. Finally, she uncovered a young woman lying motionless beneath a fallen beam. The mother was already gone. Her eyes stared silently toward the smoke-filled sky. But wrapped tightly against her chest, protected by her final embrace, was a little baby girl. The infant's tiny face was streaked with ash. She wasn't crying loudly anymore. She was simply too tired. The young woman carefully lifted the baby into her arms. For a brief moment, everything around her disappeared. The fire, the shouting, the soldiers. Only the child remained. The baby opened watery eyes and looked at her. Then, with surprising trust, tiny fingers wrapped around one of hers. The guard stormed toward her. "What are you doing? She's alive. So, she'll die if we leave her." The guard laughed without kindness. "Then she'll die." He reached for the child. The young woman stepped backward. "No." The single word surprised even her. The guard's face hardened. "You're carrying enough weight already. This is a child. This is merchandise now." She tightened her arms around the baby. "No." The guard struck her again, harder this time. Pain exploded across her cheek. Several prisoners looked away, unable to watch. One elderly woman quietly whispered, "Please, don't make it worse." But the young woman never loosened her grip. "If you want her," she said softly, "you'll have to take her from me." The guard stared at her for several long seconds. Finally he spat into the snow. "Fine." His smile was cruel. "You'll regret carrying extra weight." The journey that followed became a test of everything she believed. The slave caravan traveled for weeks across frozen roads and steep mountain paths. Food was scarce. Water was carefully measured. Every prisoner struggled simply to stay standing. Yet every evening, the young woman made sure the baby drank before she did. If there was one blanket, the child slept beneath it. If there was only enough bread for one, tiny pieces disappeared into the baby's hands before she took a single bite herself. More than once, guards laughed as they watched. "Still carrying dead weight." One sneered. "Not dead," she answered quietly. "Yet." The words never changed. Neither did her answer. One freezing night, snow fell so heavily that the prisoners could barely see the road ahead. The baby began crying from the cold. The guards shouted for silence. When the crying continued, one of them walked toward her with obvious irritation. "If that child keeps making noise." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The threat hung in the air like ice. The young woman slowly removed her own winter cloak. It was the only thick clothing she owned. Without hesitation, she wrapped it around the baby instead. By morning, her own hands had turned pale from the freezing air. Her lips trembled from cold. But the baby was warm. An older prisoner watched quietly before stepping closer during their next stop. "You'll die before reaching the capital." The young woman looked down at the sleeping child. "Then she'll have my blanket." The older woman blinked in surprise. "Why?" She smiled sadly. "Because someone should choose her." Days turned into weeks. The tiny baby slowly grew stronger. Her frightened cries became quiet laughs. She reached for the young woman's face whenever she woke. And one peaceful evening, while the prisoners rested beneath a sky filled with stars, the little girl looked into her eyes and spoke her very first clear word. "Mama." The young woman froze. The child smiled again. "Mama." Tears filled the young woman's eyes. She had lost everything. Her home. Her family. Her freedom. Yet somehow, in the middle of chains, hunger, and endless sorrow, life had placed a tiny hand into hers and given her one precious reason to keep walking. She kissed the little girl's forehead and whispered the promise that would shape the rest of her life. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring. But as long as I can stand, you will never walk through this world alone." Far above the snow-covered mountains, a lone white wolf stood silently upon a distant ridge, watching the endless caravan move slowly toward the Alpha King's lands. Its golden eyes lingered for only a moment on the woman carrying the child before it disappeared into the darkness, as though fate itself had taken its first quiet breath. Several years passed, and the terrible journey became nothing more than a scar hidden beneath quiet days. The chains were gone, the bruises had long faded, and the frightened young woman had grown into someone whose strength could not be measured by muscles or titles. She had built a simple life on the forgotten edge of the Alpha King's territory, where the forest met an open meadow and the world seemed content to leave her alone. The little girl was no longer the ash-covered baby she had carried through snowstorms. She had become a cheerful child with bright eyes and endless questions. Her laughter filled the small cottage every morning, chasing away memories that had once seemed impossible to escape. Their home was modest, but it was alive. Wild herbs hung from wooden beams to dry. Fresh bread cooled beside the window. A tiny vegetable garden stretched behind the cottage, surrounded by a low wooden fence that the child insisted kept out grumpy rabbits. Every evening they followed the same peaceful routine. The woman prepared supper. The little girl gathered firewood, always bringing one stick that was far too large for her tiny arms. "I got the biggest one today," she announced proudly. The woman smiled as she took it from her. "I can see that. I wasn't even tired." "No." The little girl grinned. "Maybe just a little." They laughed together, and for a brief moment, the past felt very far away. Yet the forest had begun to change. At first, the signs were so small that no one paid attention. The chickens stopped wandering too far from the cottage, but they never appeared frightened. The family's old horse no longer whinnied nervously at night. Instead, it stood quietly beside the fence, its ears pointed toward the trees as though listening to an old friend. Even the wild deer behaved strangely. Instead of fleeing from the meadow, they calmly grazed nearby before disappearing into the woods before sunset. Hunters noticed the difference first. "There are wolf tracks everywhere," one of them said inside the village tavern. "But no attacks." Another nodded. "My dogs refuse to enter those woods." "Mine too. They smell something." "What?" The oldest hunter lowered his voice. "They smell a king." The room fell silent. No one laughed. The stories of the Alpha King's white beast had existed for generations. It was said that ordinary wolves stepped aside when it walked. Even predators knew when the ancient guardian passed through the forest. Oh, why would such a creature remain near one forgotten cottage? No one dared search for the answer. Inside the cottage, life continued as always. The little girl spent afternoons chasing butterflies across the meadow while the woman gathered herbs near the forest edge. She always kept the child within sight. "Don't go beyond the old pine," she reminded gently. "I know," the girl called back. "But butterflies don't always listen." "Then you let them win." The child giggled. "They never win." One afternoon, while arranging flowers she had picked from the meadow, the little girl suddenly stopped and looked toward the dark line of pine trees. She smiled brightly. "Hello." The woman looked up. "Who are you talking to?" "Our big friend." She frowned slightly. "What friend?" "The fluffy one." The woman glanced toward the forest. There was nothing there. Only shadows between the trees. She smiled softly. "I think you've been imagining things." The child shook her head. "No." "Then where is he?" The little girl pointed toward the woods. "He hides because he thinks you'll be scared." The woman laughed quietly. "I doubt anyone is hiding out there." The child simply waved toward the trees before returning to her flowers. Hidden behind the thick trunks of ancient pines, two golden eyes watched in complete silence. The enormous white wolf stood perfectly still. Its thick fur blended with the lingering patches of snow beneath the trees. Its breathing remained slow. Its gaze never left the child. There was no hunger in those eyes. No aggression. Only quiet vigilance. The beast had visited the cottage for weeks. Every night it circled the small home once before disappearing back into the forest before dawn. Every morning it tried to stay away. Every evening it returned. The instinct confused even the ancient creature. It had guarded borders. It had fought enemies. It had protected its alpha countless times. But this feeling, this silent pull toward one small family, did not understand. One snowy evening, the woman stepped outside just before sunset to gather the last of the firewood. The forest stood silent beneath falling snowflakes. She bent to lift a log. Then she felt it. Someone was watching. Slowly, she looked toward the trees. Between two snow-covered pines stood a figure larger than any wolf she had ever imagined. White fur shimmered beneath the fading light. Golden eyes met hers across the silent clearing. For a heartbeat, neither moved. She should have felt terror. Every story she had ever heard told her to run. She saw something unexpected. Loneliness. The great beast looked less like a monster and more like a soul carrying an invisible burden. Its eyes held an ancient sadness that words could never explain. Before she could take another breath, the wolf turned gracefully and disappeared into the forest without making a sound. She remained frozen long after it was gone. When she finally returned inside, the little girl looked up from her drawing. "Did you see him?" The woman nodded slowly. "I think I did. I told you he wasn't pretending." She knelt beside the child. "Were you ever afraid?" The little girl frowned as though the question made no sense. "Why would I be?" "Because he's very big." The child smiled. "He watches." "How do you know?" "He always leaves before breakfast." The woman stared at her. "You've seen him before." The little girl nodded innocently. "Lots of times. And you never told me." "I thought you knew." That night, after the child had fallen asleep, the woman stood beside the window. Moonlight covered the meadow in silver. Far beyond the fence, standing at the edge of the forest, the white beast appeared once more. It did not step closer. It simply watched the cottage. Watched until every light inside was extinguished. Then it quietly vanished into the darkness. At that same moment, miles away inside the Alpha King's palace, the king awoke suddenly from another restless sleep. His breathing was uneven. His hands tightened against the blankets. He sat upright, staring into the darkness. Again. It had happened again. For the 7th night in a row. He carried the strange feeling that he had been somewhere else while asleep. His boots were covered in dried mud. A few white hairs rested on the floor beside his bed. His beast had wandered beyond the palace walls once more. He closed his eyes in frustration. "Where are you going?" he whispered into the silence. Deep inside him, the beast gave no answer, only the faint, irresistible feeling of a small cottage, hidden at the edge of the kingdom, where something precious waited, though neither the beast nor its king yet understood why. Morning arrived over the Alpha King's palace with a sound of bronze bells echoing through towering stone halls. Servants hurried across polished floors, guards changed shifts at the gates, and advisors gathered inside the council chamber long before the king entered. Everything moved with perfect order. Everything appeared strong. Only the Alpha King knew how exhausted he truly was. He stood alone on a high balcony overlooking the capital. The city stretched beneath him, alive with merchants, blacksmiths, and children beginning another ordinary day. It was the kingdom he had sworn to protect, yet lately it felt strangely distant. He had not slept peacefully in weeks. Every morning, he woke with mud on his boots and scratches on his cloak, though he remembered nothing after falling asleep. His beast had grown increasingly restless, slipping beyond his control during the night. He rested both hands on the cold stone railing. "What are you searching for?" he whispered. The question disappeared into the morning wind. No answer came. A palace guard approached quietly before bowing. "My king, the council is waiting." The Alpha King nodded once before following him through the long corridors. The council chamber was already filled. Powerful alphas from neighboring territories sat around a massive oak table. Elder advisors shuffled scrolls while noble families whispered among themselves. The moment the king entered, every conversation stopped. He took his seat without ceremony. "Begin." An elderly counselor stood first. "Our Western allies request a formal marriage alliance." Another immediately added, "The Eastern Territory has made the same proposal." A noblewoman smiled politely. "Several respected families have daughters ready to become your Luna." The king remained expressionless. "We are discussing borders. We are discussing stability," the elder corrected gently. "The kingdom needs an heir. It needs peace. And peace comes through family." Silence settled over the chamber. Everyone knew why these conversations never reached a conclusion. Years earlier, before becoming king, he had once believed he already had a future waiting for him. He had trusted people who later betrayed him. That betrayal had stolen the people he loved most and left wounds that no healer could close. Since that day, he had built walls around his heart stronger than the fortress itself. He trusted his judgment. He trusted his sword. And above all, he trusted his beast. Nothing else. A younger council member leaned forward. "With respect, Your Majesty, the pack has waited long enough." The king met his gaze. "I will not marry for convenience. It is not convenience. It is politics. It is survival." The king's voice remained calm, but the room seemed colder. "I said no." No one argued further. They had all witnessed what happened when the Alpha King made a final decision. The meeting continued with discussions of harvests, border patrols, and trade agreements. Then something changed. Without warning, a sharp pressure spread through the king's chest. His breathing became uneven. Deep inside him, his beast suddenly stirred. Not with anger, not with aggression, with urgency. His golden eyes briefly flashed before returning to normal. Several council members noticed. "My king?" one asked carefully. The Alpha King closed his eyes for only a second. The feeling grew stronger. Something was pulling him. Somewhere beyond the palace. Far beyond the city. His beast paced restlessly inside his mind. "Leave." He tightened his hands beneath the table. "Control yourself," he murmured silently. The beast refused to settle. For the first time in years, the king felt his control slipping. He rose from his chair. "The meeting is over." The elders exchanged confused glances. But we have not finished discussing the alliance. It can wait. Without another word, he walked out of the chamber. The massive doors closed behind him with a heavy echo. Inside, whispers immediately filled the room. He has never ended a council meeting like this. Something is wrong. Has the beast become unstable? None of them knew. Outside the chamber, the king walked quickly through the palace corridors until he reached the quiet training courtyard. Only there did he finally stop. He placed one hand against an old stone pillar and took a slow breath. "What is happening to you?" The beast answered with another powerful instinct. "Forest. No. A small cottage." The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The king frowned. "I don't know that place." The beast remained silent. Moments later, his captain of the guard approached with visible hesitation. "My king, there is another matter." "What is it?" "Strange reports from the northern edge of the territory." The king looked up. "What kind of reports?" The captain lowered his voice. "Villagers claim the beast has marked a cottage." The king's expression hardened immediately. "Impossible. That was my thought as well. No one has seen my beast. They insist they recognized the claw marks." The king shook his head. "Fear creates stories." "Perhaps. But..." The captain hesitated. "Not a single wolf has dared step near that house." For the first time that morning, the Alpha King felt the strange pull inside his chest become stronger. His beast had gone completely still. If it were listening. The king looked toward the distant forests beyond the palace walls. Somewhere out there, hidden among endless pine trees, stood a lonely cottage carrying a mystery that even the most powerful man in the kingdom could not explain. And for reasons he could neither understand nor ignore. He suddenly felt that whatever waited beyond those trees was about to change his life forever. The peaceful days at the little cottage came to an abrupt end 3 mornings later. The woman was hanging freshly washed clothes outside while the little girl sat on the porch, carefully dressing her cloth rabbit in tiny pieces of fabric. The child hummed happily to herself, completely unaware that several horses were making their way down the narrow forest path. The sound of hooves broke the morning silence. The woman looked up. 5 mounted officials wearing the crest of the Alpha King's council stopped in front of the cottage. Behind them stood 2 armored guards and a well-dressed nobleman whose expression carried neither kindness nor sympathy. The little girl instinctively moved closer to the woman. "Who are they?" she whispered. The woman gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right. Stay behind me." The nobleman stepped forward and unfolded a scroll sealed with crimson wax. "You are the woman known as the former border slave?" "I am." "You are also caring for an unidentified child." The woman's heart tightened. "She has a name." The nobleman barely looked at the little girl. "Our records say otherwise." He handed the scroll to one of the officials. The official cleared his throat before reading aloud. "Under Pack law, any child without blood registration, family records, or legal guardianship remains unclaimed and may be placed under council custody." The words struck like ice. The woman stared at him. "Council custody." The nobleman smiled faintly. "The child will be relocated." She already understood what that meant. Relocated. Sold. Placed into bonded service under a different name. Just as so many forgotten children had been before. "No," she said quietly. The nobleman sighed. "This is not a request. It doesn't matter what your papers say. They are the law. The law doesn't know her." The little girl slowly gripped the back of the woman's dress. The nobleman's voice became colder. "Stand aside." The woman didn't move. "I carried her across mountains." No one answered. "I kept her alive when no one else cared whether she lived another day." Still silence. "I am her family." The nobleman folded his hands behind his back. "You are not related by blood." She met his eyes without fear. Love kept her alive. For the first time, several guards lowered their eyes. Even they struggled to ignore the truth in her voice. The nobleman remained unmoved. "You have until sunset to prepare the child." Without another word, he turned toward his horse. The officials followed. Only the guards hesitated before leaving, glancing back at the small girl standing silently behind the woman. When the horses disappeared into the trees, the cottage became painfully quiet. The little girl didn't cry. She simply walked inside. A few minutes later, the woman found her kneeling beside the bed with a tiny cloth bag. Inside were her rabbit, a wooden spoon, 2 smooth stones, and a faded ribbon. "What are you doing?" the woman asked softly. The child didn't look up. "They said I have to go." "You don't." "I don't want to make trouble." Her small voice trembled. "If I leave, maybe they'll stop being angry." The woman immediately knelt beside her. She gently took the little bag from the child's hands and set it aside. Then she wrapped both arms around the little girl. "No one is taking you." "But they said." "I don't care what they said." The child finally began to cry. "What if they come back?" The woman held her tighter, even though fear had already settled deep inside her own heart. "They will," she whispered honestly. "But if they do, they will have to face me first." Neither of them noticed the enormous white wolf standing silently beyond the tree line. Hidden among the pines, the beast had heard every word. Its golden eyes remained fixed on the cottage. A low, warning growl rolled through the silent forest. For the first time in many years, the beast's patience had come to an end. Night settled over the forest like a heavy blanket of silence. A pale moon hung above the towering pines, casting silver light across the snow-covered ground. The cold air was still, and even the wind seemed unwilling to disturb the darkness surrounding the little cottage. Inside, no one slept peacefully. The woman sat beside the fireplace, pretending to mend a torn blanket while her thoughts remained fixed on the council's order. Every few moments, she glanced toward the little girl sleeping on the small bed across the room. The child had cried herself to sleep. Even in her dreams, tiny tears still rested on her cheeks. The woman quietly stood and pulled the blanket higher over the girl's shoulders. "I won't let them take you," she whispered. "I don't know how, but I won't." Outside, something moved. A large shadow slipped silently between the trees. The Alpha King's beast had returned. Its massive white form blended almost perfectly with the snow, making it look like a ghost drifting through the forest. Its golden eyes never left the cottage. For several long moments, the beast remained completely still. It listened. It could hear the slow heartbeat of the sleeping child. It could hear the steady breathing of the woman. It could also remember the voices from earlier that day. "Unclaimed. Council custody. Take the child." The words stirred something ancient inside the beast. Not anger alone. Instinct. A deep, unquestionable instinct older than the kingdom itself. Slowly, the enormous wolf stepped out of the shadows. Its paws made almost no sound against the frozen ground. It approached the front door until only a single step separated them. The beast lowered its head. For one heartbeat, it simply stared at the weathered wood. Its claws extended. With slow, deliberate strength, they scraped across the oak. The sound tore through the silent night. Rip. The deep carving echoed through the valley. Inside the cottage, the woman's head snapped toward the door. Another scrape followed, even louder. She grabbed the iron poker beside the fireplace and hurried toward the entrance, her heart pounding inside her chest. Before opening the door, she looked once toward the sleeping child. The little girl hadn't awakened. Taking a slow breath, the woman pulled the door open. Cold air rushed inside. The clearing was empty. Only drifting snowflakes danced beneath the moonlight. She stepped onto the porch and looked toward the forest. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just silence. Confused, she lowered her eyes. Her breath caught. 4 enormous claw marks stretched across the wooden door. Fresh. Each groove had cut through the thick oak as though it were soft bark. She slowly reached toward one of the marks but stopped before touching it. Something told her not to. Not fear. Respect. As though the door no longer belonged only to her. Far beyond the cottage, hidden among the trees, the beast watched quietly. Its task was finished. Without another sound, it disappeared into the darkness. Morning arrived with pale sunlight spilling across the valley. The first travelers walking the forest road noticed the damaged door almost immediately. One dropped the bundle he was carrying. Another took 3 hurried steps backward. Within minutes, whispers spread through the nearby village. "They're beast marks. I've seen them before. No ordinary wolf could do that." By midday, the entire road stood empty. No merchant dared approach the cottage. No hunter crossed the clearing. Even wolves passing nearby instinctively lowered their heads before quickly moving away. When the same council officials returned to collect the little girl, their horses suddenly refused to move forward. The animals snorted nervously and backed away from the cottage. The nobleman frowned. "What is wrong with them?" One of the guards slowly pointed toward the front door. His face had gone completely pale. "My lord." The nobleman followed his gaze. The moment he saw the claw marks, every trace of confidence vanished. His breathing became shallow. "No." An older guard whispered almost reverently. "The Alpha King's beast has claimed this place." Silence fell over the group. No one stepped off their horse. No one reached for the door. Every wolf present felt the same overwhelming instinct echo through their blood. "Do not cross. Do not challenge. Do not enter." The nobleman swallowed hard before pulling on his reins. "We're leaving. My lord, the child." He shook his head without taking his eyes off the door. "Not today." The horses turned and hurried back down the forest path, leaving the cottage untouched. From the porch, the woman watched them disappear, unable to understand why they had suddenly abandoned their mission. She looked once more at the strange claw marks across her door. They frightened everyone else. Somehow, for the first time since the officials had arrived, they made her feel safe. Far away inside the royal palace, the Alpha King suddenly paused in the middle of training, an unfamiliar calm washing over his restless heart. His beast, for the first time in many weeks, was finally at peace. The strange events surrounding the cottage could no longer be ignored. By the end of the week, every village in the Alpha King's territory was telling the same story. Some claimed the beast had chosen the woman. Others insisted the cottage had become cursed. No matter which version people believed, one fact never changed. Not a single wolf had dared cross the claw-marked doorway. The rumors finally reached the royal court with such force that the Alpha King could no longer dismiss them. "If the stories are true," one elder counselor said during the morning assembly, "then someone is using fear to challenge the authority of the throne." Another shook his head. "Or the beast has acted without its king's command." The room fell silent. The Alpha King rose from his seat. "I will see the cottage myself." No one argued. A small escort accompanied him through the northern forest, but as they neared the lonely clearing, something unexpected happened. One by one, the wolves accompanying the guards became uneasy. Several refused to move any closer. "My king," the captain said quietly, "they will not cross." The Alpha King looked toward the cottage standing peacefully beneath the tall pines. "I'll continue alone." He dismounted and walked the remaining distance without drawing his sword. The woman noticed him from the garden, where she was gathering herbs while the little girl played nearby. She immediately recognized the royal crest embroidered on his dark cloak. The little girl looked up. "Is he important?" The woman smiled gently. "Very." She stepped forward and bowed respectfully. "My king." He stopped several feet away. "You know who I am." "Everyone does." His gaze shifted briefly to the claw marks carved across the wooden door. They were exactly as described. Ancient. Undeniably real. He reached toward them. Before his fingers touched the wood, something inside him stirred. His beast. A low warning echoed through his mind. Not in anger. In protection. The king slowly lowered his hand. He frowned almost imperceptibly. That had never happened before. The woman noticed the hesitation but said nothing. Instead, she quietly invited him inside. My home is simple, but you're welcome. The Alpha King entered the cottage. It was smaller than he expected. Nothing inside suggested wealth or ambition. A wooden table. A stone fireplace. Books carefully stacked beside a rocking chair. Everything had been repaired many times, yet every object was spotless. The little girl peeked shyly from behind the woman. The king knelt slightly to meet her eyes. And who might you be? She hugged her cloth rabbit tighter. I'm Lily. It is nice to meet you, Lily. She studied him for a moment. You don't look scary. The woman looked embarrassed. Lily. The king smiled faintly. I've been told otherwise. The little girl tilted her head. Our big white friend isn't scared of you. The room became very quiet. The king's eyes slowly lifted toward the woman. Our white friend. The woman hesitated. My king. She's been seeing a white wolf near the forest. He remained perfectly still. A white wolf. She nodded. It has never harmed us. The king said nothing, but something deep inside him tightened. After a long silence, he noticed several old law books resting beside the fireplace. You can read. The woman nodded. I taught myself. Why? She looked toward Lily before answering. I wanted to understand the laws that decide children's lives. Her words stayed with him. Most people asked for favors when standing before a king. Land, gold, protection. She had asked for nothing. She had simply learned the law so she could defend a child who wasn't even her own. As he prepared to leave, Lily suddenly ran to the shelf and picked up one of the old books. She held it out toward him. You forgot your story. He looked confused. My story. She nodded confidently. Mama says every book helps someone. For the first time in years, the Alpha King laughed softly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was real. He accepted the worn book with unexpected care. I'll return it. We'll be here, Lily answered with a smile. As the king walked back toward his horse, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. The woman stood beside the little girl on the porch. Neither waved, neither spoke. Yet an unfamiliar feeling settled quietly inside his heart. It wasn't the pull of duty. It wasn't political responsibility. It was peace. And somewhere deep within him, his beast, usually restless and untamed, became completely still. As if, for the very first time in years, it had finally found the place it had been searching for all along. The days following the Alpha King's visit were anything but peaceful. Although he had spoken little during his time at the cottage, his decision to leave without ordering an arrest or investigation spread through the capital almost as quickly as the story of the claw-marked door. To some, it was a sign of wisdom. To others, it was proof that something dangerous was influencing the king. Inside the council chamber, tension hung heavily in the air. The elders had gathered before sunrise, their expressions grim as scrolls and reports covered the long oak table. The atmosphere felt colder than usual, as if the stone walls themselves had begun listening. An elderly counselor broke the silence. This has gone too far. Another nodded. The beast has acted outside the king's command. A third added. And now the king himself refuses to act. Murmurs spread around the table. One nobleman leaned forward, resting both hands on the polished wood. A former slave lives beneath the protection of the king's beast. Whether by magic or manipulation, that woman has become a threat to the order of this kingdom. The chamber doors opened. The Alpha King entered without hurry. Every voice immediately fell silent. He walked to the head of the table and remained standing. I understand there are concerns. The elderly counselor met his gaze. There are more than concerns, Your Majesty. He unrolled another scroll. Merchants refuse to use the northern road. Hunters avoid the forest. Villagers speak of omens instead of law. He paused. And all because one woman lives behind a marked door. The king answered calmly. No crime has been committed. The nobleman frowned. Perhaps not yet. Another council member rose from his chair. We request permission to detain the woman until this matter is fully investigated. The room grew quiet. The Alpha King's eyes moved slowly from one face to another. On what charge? No one answered immediately. Finally someone said, influencing the beast. The king spoke before anyone else could continue. There is no evidence of that. There is no explanation either. Silence returned. The king understood their fear. Even he could not explain why his beast had marked the cottage. But fear alone was not justice. He looked directly at the council. The law is not built upon suspicion. The elder folded his hands. Then let us investigate. The king considered the request. If she is questioned, he paused briefly, she will be treated with respect. Several nobles exchanged surprised glances. One of them spoke carefully. You would personally guarantee that? I would. Later that afternoon, royal guards arrived once again at the small cottage. This time there were no chains, no weapons drawn. The captain of the guard stepped forward and bowed respectfully. The king requests your presence. The woman looked toward Lily, who immediately reached for her hand. Am I in trouble? The little girl whispered. The woman smiled softly. No. The captain shook his head. No one is under arrest. The woman nodded. If this protects the child, I'll come. The journey to the capital was quiet. Many villagers stopped what they were doing to watch the small procession pass. Some whispered, others simply stared. The woman ignored them. Her attention remained on Lily, who sat beside her in the wagon, clutching her cloth rabbit. It's very big, Lily whispered as the palace finally came into view. It is, the woman replied. But it's only another home. Inside the palace, they were escorted into a spacious waiting hall rather than a prison cell. Soft light poured through tall windows. Books lined the walls. A warm fire burned in the fireplace. Lily looked around in amazement. There are more books here than trees. The woman laughed quietly. It does seem that way. Moments later, the Alpha King entered the room alone. No guards followed him. No council members stood beside him. He wanted this meeting to be free from fear. Lily quickly hid behind the woman's dress before peeking around the fabric. The king smiled gently. I brought your book back. He placed the worn law book carefully on the table. I finished it. Lily's eyes brightened. Did you like the ending? I think I liked the middle even more. The little girl smiled. Slowly, she stepped out from behind the woman. The king looked toward the woman. I apologize for bringing you here. You have responsibilities. So do you. She looked slightly surprised. My responsibility is much smaller. He glanced toward Lily. I don't believe it is. For several moments neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, peaceful. Finally, the king walked toward one of the shelves and removed an ancient volume bound in dark leather. I've been searching our archives. She looked at the book with curiosity. For what? For old pack laws. About children. He nodded. And guardianship. She stepped closer. Without thinking, both reached for the same page. Their hands almost touched. For a brief second, neither moved. The king quietly withdrew his hand first. She pretended not to notice the strange warmth that had passed through her chest. Together, they read the faded text. The library remained silent except for the soft crackle of the fire and the turning of fragile pages. Lily had wandered to the window, watching snowflakes drift through the palace gardens. The king glanced toward the woman. You've spent years protecting someone else's child. She answered without looking up from the page. I stopped thinking of her as someone else's long ago. He nodded slowly. I believe she stopped thinking that too. A small smile appeared on her face. It was genuine. The king realized he had been watching her smile longer than he intended. He looked back at the book, though he no longer remembered what the page had said. For the first time in many years, the palace library no longer felt like a room filled only with old laws and forgotten history. It felt slave. Outside those quiet walls, however, the council's whispers had not ended. Several powerful nobles watched through the corridor windows with growing suspicion. They didn't see a king studying ancient laws. They saw a ruler becoming emotionally involved with the one woman his beast had already chosen to protect. And in their eyes, that made her more dangerous than ever. The days after the meeting in the palace library left the kingdom divided. Some praised the Alpha King for refusing to judge an innocent woman without proof. Others believed his kindness had become weakness. Around every market stall and every campfire, people argued over the same question. Why would the king's beast protect a former slave? The loudest voices belonged to those who had the most to lose. Among them was a man the woman had prayed never to see again. His name had once been spoken with fear across the borderlands. He had built his wealth by buying villages destroyed by war, separating families, and selling survivors to the highest bidder. To him, people had never been lives. They had been profit. When he heard that the woman he once considered worthless had gained the king's attention, anger replaced caution. "If she speaks," he muttered to the noblemen gathered in his estate, "she can destroy everything." One of the nobles frowned. "Then silence her." "No," the trader replied with a cold smile. "If I silence her, I become guilty." He leaned closer. "I'll make the kingdom believe she's lying." The council announced a public hearing in the capital square so every accusation and every defense could be witnessed by the pack. By midday, hundreds of wolves filled the square. Warriors stood beside merchants. Farmers stood beside nobles. The Alpha King sat upon the stone platform, his expression calm, while the council gathered around him. The woman walked into the square holding Lily's hand. She wore the same simple dress she had always worn. No jewels, no symbols of status, only quiet dignity. Lily looked around nervously. So many people. The woman squeezed her hand gently. "I'm right here." Then the slave trader stepped forward. For the first time in years their eyes met. She recognized him immediately. The years had added gray to his hair but had changed nothing behind his eyes. They were still empty, still cruel. He smiled. "I remember you," she answered quietly. "I wish I didn't remember you." A murmur spread through the crowd. The trader turned dramatically toward the council. "This woman is dangerous because she twists the truth." He spread his hands. "I gave prisoners food." Several former captives standing among the crowd lowered their heads. "I protected children." The woman looked at him without anger, only sadness. "You sold children." His smile faded. "I followed the law. You hid behind it." The square became silent. The trader pointed toward her. "You have no proof." For several long moments she said nothing. Then she slowly reached into the cloth bag she had carried from the cottage. She removed a pair of old iron shackles. Rust covered every link. The metal had been broken but never discarded. Gasps echoed across the square. "I kept these," she said softly. "Not because I wanted to remember." Her fingers tightened around the cold iron. "But because I promised myself that one day I would never have to wear them again." She looked toward the crowd. "And neither would anyone else." Several former slaves stepped forward. One elderly woman, a young father, a scarred blacksmith. Each quietly carried their own broken chains. The Alpha King watched in complete silence. The woman turned toward the ceremonial fire burning beside the council platform. It had been prepared for official documents. She walked to it carrying the weight of her past. Without a word, she dropped the rusted shackles into the flames. The iron struck the burning wood with a sharp metallic sound. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the elderly woman stepped forward. She released her own chains into the fire. The blacksmith followed. Then another survivor. And another. Soon dozens of broken shackles burned together beneath the bright afternoon sky. The fire grew stronger. The trader's confidence disappeared. "No," he whispered. "This proves nothing." The woman looked directly at him. "It proves we survived." One of the council guards stepped forward carrying a large wooden chest. Inside lay hundreds of old ownership records seized during recent investigations. Ages, prices, human lives reduced to ink on fading parchment. The Alpha King slowly stood. His voice carried across the square. "These records recognize people as property." He looked toward the council. "They recognize no law that this kingdom will honor again." He nodded once. The guard tipped the chest into the flames. Thousands of pages disappeared beneath rising fire. Smoke carried ashes high into the sky. Many survivors began crying. Not from sorrow. From relief. Lily looked up at the woman. "Does that mean it's over?" The woman knelt and gently brushed a tear from the child's cheek. "It means no paper can ever tell you that you don't belong." The little girl smiled through her tears and wrapped both arms around her. The crowd watched in silence. The Alpha King wasn't looking at the fire anymore. He was watching the woman. Not because she had challenged the council. Not because she had spoken bravely. But because, after everything she had suffered, she had chosen healing instead of revenge. She had burned chains. Not people. Kisses. Not hatred. For the first time since losing those he had once loved, the Alpha King felt something inside his guarded heart begin to heal. Far beyond the city walls, hidden among distant pines, the great white beast lifted its head toward the smoke rising into the afternoon sky. Its golden eyes slowly closed. As if it understood that the woman it had chosen to protect had finally begun to free herself from the past that had chained her for so many years. The smoke from the ceremonial fire lingered over the capital long after the crowd had gone home. To many, it was only the smoke of burning parchment and rusted chains. To the Alpha King, it felt like the beginning of a truth that had waited years to be uncovered. That evening, the palace was unusually quiet. The council had withdrawn after the public hearing, unable to hide its frustration. Their plans to disgrace the woman had failed. Instead of fear, the people had witnessed courage. Instead of rebellion, they had witnessed compassion. Yet one mystery remained. Why had the beast chosen her? The question refused to leave the king's mind. Unable to rest, he made his way through the palace corridors until he reached the oldest part of the castle. Almost no one visited the ancient archives anymore. Dust covered the stone shelves. Thousands of forgotten scrolls rested beside books so old that their leather bindings had faded almost white. The room smelled of cedar, ink, and time. An elderly archivist looked up from his desk in surprise. "My king, I need every record concerning the beast." The old man blinked. "That collection has not been opened in decades." "Then tonight is a good night to open it." Without another question, the archivist disappeared between towering shelves before returning with 3 heavy wooden boxes. They belonged to the first Alpha Kings. The king carried the boxes himself to a long reading table. 4 hours, only the sound of turning pages filled the silent room. Most of the books described battles, ancient treaties, and stories that had become legends. None answered the question that haunted him. Midnight came. The candles burned lower. The king rubbed his tired eyes before opening one final journal bound in cracked white leather. Unlike the others, it contained no stories of war. Instead, it recorded the instincts of the royal beast. He slowly read the faded words. "There are rare moments when the beast recognizes what the heart cannot." The king frowned. He continued reading. "If an alpha carries grief so deep that it silences the mate bond, the beast may awaken first." His breathing slowed. Another passage caught his attention. "In such times, the beast does not claim territory." He turned the page. "It claims sanctuary." The room suddenly felt very still. The king continued reading with growing disbelief. The claw mark upon a doorway is older than the kingdom itself. It is not a warning to the chosen. It is a warning to the world. His heart pounded. This home is under the beast's protection. He stared at the words. For several long moments he could not move. His memories began returning one by one. The restless nights. The muddy boots. The unexplained exhaustion. The overwhelming urge to travel north. The peace he had felt only when standing near the cottage. Then another memory surfaced. The first moment he had seen the woman standing beside Lily in the garden. He had thought she looked familiar. Not because they had met before. Because something inside him had recognized her. He closed the journal. So. His voice barely escaped his lips. It wasn't protecting the house. The beast stirred quietly within him. For the first time it answered. Not with words. With feeling. Warmth. Safety. The king closed his eyes. You knew. The beast remained calm. You knew long before I did. He finally understood. The beast had never been acting against him. It had been protecting what his wounded heart had been unable to accept. Years of grief had buried the mate bond so deeply that only the ancient instincts of the beast could still feel it. Every journey through the forest, every sleepless night, every silent watch outside the cottage. None of it had been random. The beast had been guarding its future family. At dawn, the king left the archives carrying the ancient journal. He rode alone toward the northern forest. The rising sun painted the snow with soft golden light as he reached the familiar cottage. The woman was already outside, hanging blankets on a line while Lily chased birds across the meadow. The little girl spotted him first. You're back. He smiled gently. I said I'd return. Lily ran toward him before stopping politely a few steps away. Did you finish all the books? He laughed quietly. Not yet. I think there are too many. I believe you're right. The woman approached, brushing flour from her hands. My king. He shook his head slightly. Today. I'd rather you simply speak to me. She looked surprised. I don't think that would be proper. A faint smile appeared on his face. Perhaps not. For a moment neither spoke. The morning was peaceful. Snow melted slowly from the rooftops. Birds sang in the trees. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain. Felt familiar. The king finally held out the ancient journal. I found something. She accepted it carefully. What is it? A forgotten truth. She read the first page quietly before looking back at him. I don't understand. The claw marks. He looked toward the weathered door where the deep scars still remained. They weren't made to imprison you. Her eyes followed his. They were made to protect you. She stared at him in silence. The beast believed this home had become its sanctuary. And why would it believe that? The king took a slow breath. Because. For the first time in years, the proud Alpha King allowed every wall around his heart to fall. It recognized someone I wasn't ready to recognize. She searched his face, seeing no pride, no command, only honesty. The beast knew, he continued softly. It recognized the bond long before I could. Tears slowly filled her eyes, not from shock, but from the quiet weight of everything that suddenly made sense. The restless wolf, the marked door, the strange feeling of safety whenever the white beast appeared. None of it had been chance. Lily looked between them with innocent confusion. So, she smiled. Our big white friend wasn't lost. The king looked at the little girl and smiled warmly. No. He was trying to find his way home. The child grinned. I knew he was nice. The king looked once more at the claw marks on the cottage door. Marks the kingdom had mistaken for fear. Marks that had never represented danger. They had always meant something far greater. Silent promise. That as long as the beast still breathed, no harm would ever cross that doorway again. The truth spread through the kingdom more slowly than rumors ever had. Fear had traveled like wildfire. Hope traveled like sunrise. One heart at a time. In the days that followed, the Alpha King ordered the ancient records copied and shared with every council elder. The forgotten writings left little room for argument. The claw marks upon the cottage door had never been a challenge to the throne. They were one of the oldest traditions of the royal bloodline, a sacred declaration that the beast had recognized a sanctuary long before its alpha understood why. Not every noble accepted the truth willingly. Some still whispered that a former slave could never become the king's mate. Others believed tradition should belong only to those born into powerful families. The Alpha King listened to every objection without raising his voice. Then, when the council had finished speaking, he rose from his throne. "The strength of a kingdom," he said calmly, "is not measured by the blood someone is born with." The chamber became silent. "It is measured by the lives they choose to protect." His golden eyes moved slowly across every noble seated before him. She protected a child when the world abandoned her. No title ordered her to do so. No law rewarded her. She simply chose compassion. He paused. "If any among you believes that makes her unworthy." His voice remained steady. "Then you have forgotten what it truly means to lead." No one answered. Even those who disagreed lowered their eyes. The meeting ended without another challenge. Later that afternoon, the Alpha King rode alone toward the small cottage one final time. There were no royal banners, no guards, no ceremony. Only one man crossing a quiet forest beneath a clear winter sky. The familiar cottage stood exactly as it always had. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney. Lily was outside attempting to build a snow wolf much larger than herself. She looked up and immediately smiled. "You're here." "I am." She dusted snow from her gloves and pointed proudly toward her creation. "It looks more like a sheep." The king studied it thoughtfully. "I think it needs bigger ears." Lily laughed. "I knew something was wrong." The woman stepped onto the porch carrying a basket of freshly baked bread. When she saw him, she offered the same gentle smile she always had. "My king." He looked at her quietly. Then, for the first time since they had met, he said something unexpected. "My name." She blinked. He smiled softly. "I think you've earned the right to use my name." A warm silence settled between them. She nodded. "Very well." She spoke his name carefully, almost as though testing how it sounded. It somehow felt more personal than any royal title ever had. He looked toward the old claw marks still carved across the wooden door. Snow had gathered inside the deep grooves, making them stand out even more clearly. "They're still here. I never wanted to remove them." "I'm glad." She looked at him curiously. "Why?" "Because they remind me." "Of what?" He took a slow breath. "That even when I couldn't see the truth, my beast could." For a few moments neither spoke. The forest around them remained peaceful. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh bread through the clearing. Finally, the king turned toward her completely. "I've spent years believing that strength meant carrying every burden alone." She listened quietly. "I built walls so high that nothing could reach me." His eyes softened. "I thought those walls kept everyone safe. They only kept me lonely." The woman looked down for a moment before answering. "I understand loneliness. I know. And I know fear." "So do I." Their eyes met. Not as ruler and subject. Not as alpha and former slave. Simply as two people who had survived more pain than either had ever wished for. The king slowly stepped forward. "I cannot change your past." She shook her head gently. "No. I cannot give back the years that were stolen from you." "No. But," his voice became quieter, "if you'll allow me, I would like to be part of every year that comes next." Tears filled her eyes. Not because of grand words. Because there were no grand words. Only honesty. Only choice. He lowered himself onto one knee before her. Not because tradition demanded it. Because respect did. The most powerful man in the kingdom looked up at the woman who had once walked into his lands wearing chains. I am not asking because fate commands it. He continued softly. I am asking because I have come to admire your courage, your kindness, and the way you chose love when the world offered you cruelty. He held out his hand. Will you accept me? Not only as your alpha, but as the man who wishes to spend the rest of his life beside you. The clearing became perfectly still. Even the wind seemed to wait. The woman looked at his outstretched hand. Then at Lily. The little girl stood nearby, holding her cloth rabbit tightly. There was hope in her eyes. Not expectation. Oh. The woman smiled through her tears. You once asked for nothing from me. The king nodded. So today. She placed her hand gently in his. I choose freely. Yes. A quiet breath escaped his lips. Not a victorious breath. A relieved one. At that exact moment, a familiar movement appeared between the trees. The great white beast stepped silently into the clearing. For the first time it did not remain hidden. Its magnificent white coat shone beneath the afternoon sunlight, and its golden eyes rested peacefully upon the three people standing before the cottage. Lily ran forward only a few careful steps before stopping. Hello again. The enormous wolf lowered its head gently. The little girl laughed. I knew you weren't scary. The beast walked slowly toward the porch before lying down beside the claw-marked door. It closed its eyes. Not because it was tired. 'Cause its watch was finally over. The woman looked at the beast. So this is where you always wanted to be. The king smiled. No. He wrapped a gentle arm around her shoulders. This is where we were always meant to be. As the sun began to set, villagers cautiously emerged from the forest paths. One by one they approached the cottage. For years, no wolf had dared cross the marked doorway. Now they understood why. The marks had never been a threat. They had been a promise. A promise that true strength exists to protect, never to rule through fear. Children laughed in the snow. Neighbors shared warm bread. The council elders bowed their heads in quiet acceptance. No chains remained. No fear remained. Only family. As twilight settled over the kingdom, the Alpha King, his chosen mate, and the little girl stepped together across the threshold of the once-forgotten cottage. Behind them, the ancient claw marks remained untouched. Not as scars upon a door, but as a reminder that sometimes the strongest heart in a kingdom is not the one that wears the crown. Sometimes, it is the one that refuses to let a single child face the darkness alone. And from that day forward, no wolf in the pack ever dared cross the beast's mark, not because they feared its fury, but because they honored the love it had protected from the very beginning.